Yugioh! It's a franchise that stood the test of time, and for better or worse, has been fun to talk about on the channel. Although I would guess that at least one of my editors is plotting my demise for having them edit so many Yu-Gi-Oh videos. But I figured I'd take my chances and talk about some of the Yu-Gi-Oh video games. I mean, I'm not gonna touch Master Duel for a while, mainly because the cancer that is Telements that has already infested the game. So I figured we'd take a look into the distant past and talk about a few of the older Yu-Gi-Oh games, one that too many has been long sealed away in a tomb within our memories. A forbidden memory, one might say. What the hell? Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories, the topic of today's video, was a game for the original PlayStation that came out in 1999 in Japan. And for us filthy gun-slinging Americans, it was 2002. It was one of the earliest Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games that many people from the 90s can remember, and to be honest, it really shows its age. When the game came out, it was met with mixed reviews, being released way back into the Duel Monsters age of Yu-Gi-Oh! Even the rules for Forbidden Memories itself reflects that to a degree. And you really only need to look towards some of the character designs and how they have that old retro look, or how they have some oddities here. For example, look at Isis, who is obviously supposed to be a Shizu Ishtar, only with evil eyes. Or the fact that certain characters are in completely non-canon events. There's about as much continuity in this timeline as there is if you tried to make sense of every piece of macaroni art you made as a kid. Basically, continuity with original Duel Monsters canon ain't gonna happen. The only continuity you're gonna get is that Duelist of the Roses is canon to this game. And that for some reason, Prince Henry Tudor suddenly thinks that modeling your hair after Patrick Star is the greatest fashion statement of all time. The story is also really bare bones, and it amounts to being some abridged fanfiction that someone who drunkenly skimmed over the entire Duel Monsters script would have wrote. The only thing you're here for is the gameplay. Oh, and the music too, I guess. Contrary to what reviewer scores say, Forbidden Memories has an interesting gameplay loop to it. Now, if you think you're throwing down about $400 in order to play Kashtira and essentially make it so your opponent can't play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is gonna help you here, you're either delusional or you've never played this game. Considering how old this game is, I'm assuming you're basically sucking a pacifier and going, "Mommy, who is this mean old man yelling at me?" So let me tell you now. The rules have said, screw your money, Seto, I am the rules. And those rules are also kind of broken too. Now, in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, monsters were essentially just the canes that the rich old guy in something like Oliver Twist would bludgeon his wife with. And whoever had the bigger number was going to be the winner. At least until the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh!, rest in peace my lord and savior Kazuki Takahashi, changed the manga to follow the card game because it got super popular. The same thing can apply here, and much like the early manga and anime editions of the game, stars on a monster are just decorations. The higher the star rating, the brighter the Christmas tree, basically. You don't need to tribute cards in order to play stronger ones. Monsters don't have effects, and every time you start your turn, you draw till you have 5 cards in your hand. It basically did what Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s did before 7s. Yay! Other changes that were applied is that you can only play 1 card per turn onto the field, so you can either play a monster, spell, or trap card once per turn. Granted, if you're starting to get one too many cards in your hand for your liking, there's a neat little trick that you can do that my editor likes to call bullshit. I mean fusion. Fusion in the original TCG was basically when you used a special spell card to combine 2 monsters into a brand new one. It was a very common thing to see this in decks at the time. But in this awkward PS1 game, it was quite a weird oddity. Aside from the fact there's no need for a spell card to activate fusion, it merely requires you to move the cursor to the cards you want and selecting them with the up button, there are some very weird and random fusion results you can get. Mind you, it wasn't always nonsensical. For example, combining a dragon and a thunder monster to get Thunder Dragon, or the superior twin-headed Thunder Dragon, or combining a fire monster with a warrior will get you a fire warrior like Flame Swordsman. But if you're not careful when you combine cards, it can bite you in the ass. The way this works is if you have a combination that ends up being wrong, then whichever card was played first will be discarded. In almost every way, fusion is your go-to trump card for a majority of the game, and the results can be life-saving. But let's say the card you got isn't enough, and you know it. You're biting your nails wondering what to do. You have what it takes to make a twin-headed Thunder Dragon, but your opponent has a Black Skull Dragon. Your measly twin-headed good boy ain't gonna cut it. But then, Like a light in a dark void, something catches your eye. That's right, you see the one, the only, Bright Castle! You have at your disposal what are known as spell and trap cards. Much like the actual game, you can play a variety of spell or traps, all of them offering just as many effects that can range from stat buffs to stat debuffs for your opponent, all the way to nuking an entire field. Let's say you play a field spell which can power up some monsters by 500 points, or lower the power of some monsters. Some monsters will get a buff, but others might get nothing, or get worse. So playing stuff like fairies or machines are honestly a detriment to play since they're more often than not be at a disadvantage. The quick spells, however, are more often your best bet for turning a bad situation around since they allow you to power up your monsters usually by 500 points each. Although Megamorph will boost your monster by 2, meaning it's double the normal stat buff. But you also have to be careful because some equipped cards cannot be used on some monsters. And some cards are just completely useless. Take the ritual cards for example. Much like in real-life Yu-Gi-Oh!, ritual cards aren't great. Not only due to the fact that you need to have 3 separate and specific monsters on the field, some of which are incredibly hard to get on their own, but rituals are essentially phased out because you're better off just trying to get the monster cards themselves. Let's give an example. Let's say you want to play Magician of Black Chaos, and for some reason you've consumed enough alcohol to get it via ritual summoning. You need the following cards. Winged Dragon of the Fortress 1. Okay, that makes sense since that was a card in the original Yugi's deck and was the first monster he ever played in the anime, but Blast Juggler is also one of those cards. For some damn reason. I guess the developers decided to huff some of Blast Juggler's special fuel. And then there's Dark Magician. Now, you may be thinking to yourselves, oh, that doesn't sound too bad, you're just complaining about collecting cards. Oh, you sweet, demented fools and ignorant children. Here's the thing. If you know anything about Yu-Gi-Oh!, you're probably thinking to yourself that probably the hardest card to get in this game is Dark Magician. And don't get me wrong, we'll talk about card drops in a little bit, but there are only about 4 opponents that you can possibly, and I mean possibly, get the card from, either in the campaign or in Free Duel, where you'll spend most of your time in the game. But here's the kicker. You can never play the ritual spell because you can't get Winged Dragon number 1 in this game. Forbidden Memories has a total of 722 cards in the game, however 33 of those cards are unattainable in the Western releases of it. You can only get 689 of those cards! Hell, you can't even get the Dark Magic Ritual card because of this. Even the game's auto-win condition, Exodia, is locked behind this with 2 of its pieces being a part of the 33 locked cards. Now, you may be wondering yourself, why are these 33 cards unattainable in a game that's essentially a prehistoric gacha game from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Ages, where the point is to get the cards? Well, to make a long story short, there was a device called the Pocket Station. It was a Japanese memory card peripheral that allowed you to play small mini-games on it and access specialized content for certain games. And it was only available in Japan. And wouldn't you know it, Forbidden Memories was one of those games. And unfortunately, those who got the game in the US and Europe got screwed over twofold. The first is that Sony never released the Pocket Station outside of Japan. Duh. And the second was, even if you got your hands on a Pocket Station for those secret cards, Konami themselves removed the support of the Pocket Station from Forbidden Memories. Although, funnily enough, games like Final Fantasy VIII, even when localized, still had the Pocket Station support in it. So, for a card collecting game, this is nothing short of a pure WHAT THE F**k from me and anyone who knows about this. Sir, I've removed the Pocket Station stuff from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Game. Good, now ship this crap out. But sir, I still have to program the cards that were on the Pocket Station. To quote a certain someone, what were they thinking? Thank God for mods. Now here's a joke to lighten the mood a bit. Card drops in Forbidden Memories. That was a lie. It's not even a joke. There is a card drop system, and it's bad. So for the uninitiated, I'm going to explain how to get cards. First, there's the drop mechanic, the joke. Whenever you defeat an opponent, depending on how you do in the game, you'll get a rank, and that'll determine 2 of your prizes. What card you get as a reward, and the number of star chips, which can be used to get you more cards. That's right. More cards! But while the drop system was a joke, this next method of getting cards is even more akin to a nightmare. You see, back in the day, if you had the actual cards, you could input the numbers on the card's left corner into a good number of Yu-Gi-Oh games. You can actually get the card for yourself to use in them. It was a simple thing that really tied the TCG to the video game counterpart, something that the current games don't actually do. And I know what you're thinking, well, there you go, Kamen, now you can get the better cards. You just gotta grind. However, you are so wrong that you make me want to bust out a dead meme. You see, in the infinite wisdom of the Konami developers, they decided to make the prices for a number of iconic cards be a pretty hefty penny, even for cards that aren't that good. And what number was this hefty cost at? Well, I'll tell you this much, Thanos doesn't think it was worth it.
Oh no! No!
Oh my fucking god, do you see this? It's bad enough that you can only get a max of 5 chips per victory, but 999,999 star chips? If you convert this many star chips to dollars, you'd be looking at the same price Elon Musk spent on purchasing Twitter. So if you wanted to spend time getting enough star chips for this, you'd be looking at yourself in the mirror when you were geriatric by the time you got a single good card. If you're a fresh young kid and have even a single good card from this system, then you might as well roll me up in a Bugatti and say, what shade of white is your blue eyes white dragon? So as you can see, your access to some cards is nearly impossible. So unless you can use a Game Shark or you can mod the game, you're kinda screwed. Of course, that's not the only way the game cheats you. It's just one of the biggest middle fingers that this game likes to give people. But here's the thing, the game can be tolerable if you manage to get the right cards. For example, your starting deck is randomized, and if you can make this card, you at the very least stand a chance. The Busted Fusion mechanic allows you to take any dragon that has over 1600 attack points and any thunder monster, then you can create this 2800-ton battleship and mop up the early parts of the game fairly easily, even without many equips. Or so you think. So here's the thing about Forbidden Memories. When you're playing the game, the last parts of the prologue set up, there's quite a bit of a jump in difficulty. And it's all thanks to this guy, Heishin. I think that's how you pronounce it. One of the major antagonists of the game. And it's basically an early sneak peek into the difficulty of the latter half of the overall game. And here's something I need to explain to you. If you lose any duel in the campaign, save for this one scripted one against Heishin, that's it, you're done. This isn't too bad if you do save every so often. However, in the latter half, you have to deal with the high mages and their lackeys. At the temples, each representing one of the different field spells in the game. You need to defeat the lackey, then the mage. Then you can leave after you beat the lackey, but if you do and return to the temple, you're gonna be facing the lackey again. You gotta beat the high mage too at the same time, otherwise you'll be stuck. And some of these mages pack as much punch as Heishin. And our good boy here just ain't gonna cut it by himself. It might not be a terrible challenge for some, but considering what my editor went through in an old Let's Play he did,
Oh my fucking god! What?
for some, it's an eldritch nightmare. But I also bring this up because of the final gauntlet. You see, for the final part of the game, you need to face off against 6 opponents without saving. So if you lose to one of them, then you're out. And this sucks because these guys have the best cards in the game, including the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, a monster that has 4,500 attack points. And that wouldn't be so bad, but the AI cheats. Yeah, you heard me. This game legit cheats you. You remember when I brought up Game Shark? Well, there's a code that allows you to see what cards your opponent has in their hand, and it was confirmed that the game will actively change the cards in their hands in order to counter your stronger monsters. The game literally pulls a Bandit Keith on your ass. So, this game is actively kicking you in the balls and shoving a hot fireplace poker up your ass, while expecting you to sit there and beg for more. It will do whatever it can to screw you over. It's hard, very hard, unreasonably hard even. But it's not impossible. There are a few tips that you can do in order to maximize your chances to beat this dirty cheater. Tip number 1. You need Raigeki or Black Hole. Remember when I talked about how your starter deck was randomized? Yeah, much like how a ton of Pokemon players will farm starters to get a shiny or the right nature, you want to do the same with your starting deck to have either of these cards. Raigeki is a spell that destroys all your opponent's monsters, meanwhile Dark Hole destroys everything. Raigeki is the obvious better pick since you don't run the risk of destroying any of your cards, but Black Hole is your next best option. Tip number 2. Farm Simon. So this one can be missed, since at the start of the campaign you run away from a guy named Simon Moran. He's the first duelist in the game that you can challenge, and once you do, you can farm him in free duel, which can get you a lot of cards that are useful for the early game, and get some star chips too. Tip number 3, fusion rules! You want to really utilize the fusion mechanic pretty quick, as it allows you to create powerful cards from weaker ones. I already brought up the twin-headed Thunder Dragon example, but if you combine plants with a zombie, you get Pump King, the King of Ghosts. Fusing a plant and a dragon will net you B-Dragon Jungle King, and combining a zombie and a dragon will get you Cursed Dragon depending on certain factors. Those factors being that you need to consider the attack points of your monsters before fusing them. If, for example, we have a dragon and a plant looking to make B-Dragon Jungle King, if either of them have more than 2100 base attack points, that fusion will fail. Oh, and 2 things that the game doesn't tell you is that some cards are multi-typed, and the game will always go with the weakest result when you fuse with them. So if you had Dragon Zombie, a card that counts for fusion for a dragon and a zombie type, if you combine it with a thunder monster, you'll get Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon. Tip number 4, get Jirai Gumo. Okay, so this is basically an easy card to get that has high attack value. Nightmare Fuel over here is a 2200 attacker that gains advantage in the forest, and oddly enough is really cheap to get via the password. For about 80 star chips. That's about 16 5-star duels to get, and it isn't hard to achieve. It's a strong card that doesn't need fusion to make. Tip number 5, Guardian Stars. So here's something that I missed earlier, but each card has 2 Guardian Stars to them. Think of them as elements, and each star is strong against another, and this is shown whenever you battle an opponent. What happens is that if a monster has a stronger Guardian Star than the other, it gains 500 attack during the battle. But here's a diagram on screen to explain it. Think of it like typing in Pokemon. The Water Star beats the Fire Star. Sorry Charizard, but Blastoise beats you. And word of advice, the CPU will typically pick the default Guardian Star. Take advantage of it. Tip number 6, farm the Meadow Mage. For some damn reason, this ugly SOB here has the best drops in the entire game. I'm not kidding. When you get to the second half of the game, go to the Meadow Temple, beat this loser the first time, leave, and go farm in free duel. If you can get high ranks against this guy, he'll drop cards such as the Dark Magician, Gaia the Fierce Knight, and of course, the GOAT! The GOAT! This is Meteor Black Dragon, a card that by itself can pretty much win all but one fight without a single equip card. Blue Eyes White Dragon, trash! Gate Guardian, with the Sun Guardian he went from being the gatekeeper to being gate kept. Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon? Yeah, you're gonna need like 3 bright castles to do this. So yeah, the GOAT of free duels. I don't know why he drops the best cards in the game, but he just does! Tip number 7, farm Pegasus for spells. So in order to do this tip, you're gonna have to beat your opponent by deck out. And in this case, we're talking Pegasus. There are 2 different classifications to get the S rank. Power, abbreviated as POW, where you get to beat your opponent in a few turns through raw brute force, and Tech, where you deck out your opponent. Essentially, you're great for flexing your skill rather than your big fat meat stick. S-Tech, however, takes a good while since your opponent is running about a 40-card deck, but you can get some pretty good spell cards. Hell, if you've been grinding, you can get yourself a Bright Castle equip spell that I mentioned before, which can power up any monster by 500 points. And Pegasus is the one character who drops it the most, if you get the S-Tech. I'd recommend you farm some good OP monsters that keep him on the defensive after he wastes a few cards in Fusion, since you draw as many cards as the Fusion wasted. Just don't fuse anything yourself. Tip number 8. After you beat about 2 high mages, you can unlock an easily missable duel against Seto, one of the final boss rush additions. The Labyrinth Mage is also a part of the story section, and if you do this, you'll remove one part of the boss rush. Granted, this is for a game that's well over 20 years old at this point, but people are still playing this game to this day. And hell, there's a healthy mod community for it. One mod that really works is the 5-card drop, which, if the name didn't give it away, whenever you beat an opponent, you get 5 cards instead of 1. And one mod that I personally like is FM Arrange. Not only does it have a 5-card drop, but also included new cards from the other generations of Yu-Gi-Oh!, has a bit more balance on strong cards, made the card prices a bit more manageable, makes the card text much more understandable, and overall I find it to be a much more fun experience. AI still cheats like a bitch though. In any case, if you guys want to get the chance, go find yourself a ROM and emulator to play this game. Or if you want to slog through the original, then you can always pick up a copy from Amazon. I see used copies on there going for about $60 to $70. Honestly, a reasonable price. Or I'm just a simp for nostalgia. Either way, with that, I bid you adieu. I'm MangaKamen, and remember that you too could be the reincarnation of an ancient Egyptian prince. Either that or a little nobody like Joey Wheeler. A card. A card. My kingdom for a card. You know, I miss the good old days of Yu-Gi-Oh games, back when there was a lot of creativity and the games weren't just glorified real card simulators. Don't get me wrong, those kinds of games are necessary. Have you seen the price of actual Yu-Gi-Oh cards nowadays? What the fuck? High-rate robbery for something so small and fragile. Not that I'm one to throw stones, but back in the golden days of the PS1, 2, Game Boy Advance, and even the GameCube, Yu-Gi-Oh games did a lot more experimentation with the concept and even played around with the premise of the story. Then when Tag Force series came out, it essentially became a retelling of the Yu-Gi-Oh stories with a very low-level dating sim attached to it. Oh well, at least Bashi Misawa got a more dignified sign-off in those games.
Can't he do that with pants on?
But we're not here to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh GX. Again. No, today we're going to be talking about the Yu-Gi-Oh games, and in this specific case, the classic Duelists of the Roses. Man, that title screen brings back memories. I used to play this game on Saturday nights, grinding out against the AI to get those cards.
It's Saturday night. I have no date, a 2-liter bottle of Shasta, and my all-rush mixtape. Let's rock.
What the hell is this?
Most of the time when people talk about Yu-Gi-Oh games, Forbidden Memories comes up. Heck, that was one of the first Yu-Gi-Oh game videos I talked about on this channel, Duelists of the Roses. Yeah, now this is what I call more of a step in the right direction, at least for me. Not only did the game include more monsters, but also expand upon the gameplay in a unique way, with a tactical RPG mindset put into it, and had more cohesive storyline. Nowadays, Yu-Gi-Oh games are just about the actual card game itself, and while Master Duel is fun, I long for the days of Duelists of the Roses, because while it's not the deepest story out there, it still had a lot more creativity with the story and gameplay than Master Duel ever will. I know we really can't do something like Duelists of the Roses nowadays because of how big the card pool is, but it's sad that after the original run of Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh games didn't really experiment that much. Unless you're talking about Wheelie Breakers, but I ain't gonna touch that one. No. Duelists of the Roses is a weird beast. The game was released early in the PlayStation 2's life, coming to America in 2002, and eventually got remade into a greatest hits because it did commercially well at the time. Granted, critics at the time weren't so favorable.
Play this game long enough and you'll feel like a complete loser.
Hey now, why don't you tell me what you really think about this game, pal? I don't know, I remember having a lot of fun with this game about 20 years ago, and while I'm obviously a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh, this game was before I really got into the card game itself, at least to the extent nowadays. But enough stalling, let's get into the game.
I don't think
So, what's this game all about? Well, yes, you get ripped out of your time period and you're being dragged into 15th century England during the actual War of the Roses. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh has been known to play around with the Egyptian history since it took a lot of influence from Egyptian culture, so it's kinda weird to see a game based on actual war in England, with Yami Yugi taking the identity of Henry Tudor. You know, looks like this guy. Name a better glow up, especially with that perfectly coiffed hair. The plot of the game is, dumb. After a massive plot dump, just so we can hurry things up, you're summoned by this guy, Simon McMurran. A guy who seems a bit too happy to see me. This is your basic isekai plot. What with you basically being a blank slate of a character, you don't even know what you look like. All we're missing is Truck-kun and you have any generic anime plot here, pal. Apparently, we're the chosen one in this plot. The Rose Duelist, who is destined to defeat the evil forces of Rosencruz. I don't know what you're expecting here, pal. I'm just a YouTuber. More than likely, you summoned me while I was wearing my pajamas and downing a can of caffeine-free Diet Pepsi. Is this what a legendary duelist looks like to you? After that, we're then told to input our name, and here's something that's interesting. What you input here is actually relevant to the game's programming as it determines which starter decks you'll have access to at the beginning of the game. There are about 17 different starter decks and each has their own typings to them. One of the better decks you can get your hands on is the Fairy King Truesdale deck, which has a lot of insects in it. I'll explain later since that's not the deck I'll be using, but for now let's put in the name Keith. And no, that's not my real name, I just want to be patriotic.
In America.
After that, Simon here basically explains the plot, again, with him saying that we're supposed to help his side. Look, Simon, I'm gonna level with you. You summoned me out of nowhere, I'm dressed in my sweatpants, and frankly, I'm pretty sure I'm stuck in 1485 England with no actual way out of here. I wouldn't get your hopes up with me being the most cooperative chosen one around here, okay? There is a tutorial for the game that you can play, but it's really slow and monotonous, and it's much easier just to learn as you go. Thankfully, you can skip it, and even skip it if you were an idiot like me who clicked on it by accident. We then get to choose our 3 decks, so it's essentially the good old Pokemon formula, only with card games. Now here's why I chose the name Keith, because there was a deck that I wanted, the deck with Robotic Knight. It's a deck that has a lot of machines and warrior types in it, but it's also why I chose this name. Not that it's a great deck. Again, if you're new to the game, you want to go with Fairy King Truesdale, which funnily enough I did get in the selection as well. However, there's a reason why I chose this deck, and it's petty as all hell. Look, Simon, I appreciate a free deck of cards as much as the next guy, but you gotta understand that...
Let's fucking go!
Oh hell yeah, I don't even care if that armor is impractical as all hell. It's the best character in the game, Seto. Why is he the best character? Well, aside from being another version of Seto Kaiba, this guy here offers us a choice on whether we want to be with the Lancastrian dorks or side with the Yorkists, who actually have a way to get us actually back to our own time. Do you even think that the Honorable Common would even lend an ear to your ridiculous proposal? You know you didn't have to kick him off, I was gonna let the old man go. Meh. Not like we see the old guy after this scene anyway. Yeah, I'm gonna be straight up here, you aren't going to get a very deep story with this game, which kinda sucks since the premise for it is pretty fun, and could lead to some interesting interactions in the game, especially if you could effectively choose to be a part of either faction. If you side with the Yorkists like I did, I would have loved to have chilled with 15th century Rex and Weevil. I mean, that'd be a fun scene or two, maybe offer some sort of characterization for them. You essentially have almost free reign to do whatever you like with the characters in this game's narrative, but it's mostly just window dressing. Most people who aren't buffs of the time period wouldn't realize that this game basically has Mai married to Pegasus, Taya is Yugi's future wife, Tristan is her half-brother, and Solomon Moto is his uncle Jasper. The entire relationship chart is thrown out the window and nothing is really done with it. You essentially have an alternate universe of the original cast of Yu-Gi-Oh! With an English and French flavor tossed in, and you do nothing with it! You could have done some fun stuff with the characters who are in war and used cards to fight against the opposing side. Maybe offer more dialogue choices that are just fluff to the characters, since the game does open up with choices, but that's pretty much all you're gonna get. It'd be like expecting a YouTuber to actually care about their content, but lack the technical abilities to really push it harder for their audience, especially when there's potential in the content. But I wouldn't know any of that. I want to be clear that I do love this game, but I will readily admit that this game has a lot of lost potential with pretty much everything in it. I wouldn't say it's terrible though, not by a long shot, but I will say there could have been a lot more with this style of gameplay and story. So let's take a look, and since we've taken the Yorkist route, let's begin the game proper. Glory of England! So, since we joined the badass side of Seto and the Yorkists, our opponents are the supposed good guys who have taken on the appearance of the protagonists and their allies in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and manga. And our first opponent is Taya.
The Rose Duelist! You dare to betray the hopes of Princess Yugi?
I mean, I got summoned here in the middle of the night. What do you want from me? Hell, you guys were losing and you needed me to win. That tells me that I'm the key player here. Don't hate the player, hate the game, which we should get into. And to start off, if you understand classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, you're already halfway there to understanding this game. How this game goes is a little similar to the actual card game. However, the board is 7x7 tile frames. Each turn, both players draw till they have 5 cards in their hands, but can ultimately place 1 card on the field adjacent to where their deck leader is on the board. Deck leaders are essentially the avatar of both players in the game, and once per turn, you can move to an adjacent square on the board. Your goal is to defeat the opposing deck leader. You can do this by battling their monsters in attack position and inflicting damage to their life points, move your monsters up to their deck leader and attack them directly, make them run out of cards, or surround the opposing deck leader so they can't play a card. There are differences between this and the actual card game, such as the fact that your monsters need to be next to a monster or a deck leader in order to attack it. You start the duel with 4 stars, and every time you start your turn you get 3 more stars. These allow you to summon monsters that use those stars, which are indicated on the cards themselves. Spells and traps don't need to use stars and can be placed onto the field wherever you want next to your opponent, and can be placed onto the field. The game also takes a few pages out of Forbidden Memories, a game I talked about on the channel not too long ago, meaning you can use cards in your hand, although you have to be careful, as you cannot exceed more than 5 monsters and 5 spells and traps on the field at a time, otherwise the new card will just be deleted. Damn it! This can be combining appropriate monsters and will fuse them to a new monster or powering up your monsters with spells to make them stronger. It's also a good idea to do it if you want to get a fresh hand next turn. Pro tip, if you want to do this, make sure your final card is a spell, trap, or a low level monster, so you can take advantage of the amount of stars you have in your pool. There are a lot more intricate details to the gameplay, which we'll go over later in the video. That's the basic gist, and we already got a good start to the gameplay. Honestly, a fairly complex take on the tactical RPG where you have to guide your cards across the field and attack your opponent's units in turn, as well as keeping your thoughts on the field as well. An added level of complexity is that your monsters can be in face-down attack position, which is something that is completely going against the core rules of Yugioh.
Screw the rules, I have money.
Getting to the specific opponent, Taya, I read a few posts online saying that she happens to be extremely hard to beat. I don't know how to really respond to that, as while I did have a little bit of pushback, I was able to fight back rather easily and get the win. Taya's deck isn't all that great unless you selected a Fiend type starter deck, since her deck doesn't really have any monsters whose baseline strength is 2000 or more, and the terrain doesn't exactly help her out either. I will get to the terrain soon, since that's a major part of the gameplay to take in consideration as well, but it doesn't really come up in the duel since Taya is supposed to be the first opponent on this route, and is supposed to be the easiest of the duelists. Once you defeat an opponent, we're treated to a small mini roulette game where, depending on how many of your opponent's cards are in the graveyard, you can take your chances to turn, getting monsters and not getting the lesson that we should have learned. This is a vast improvement from Forbidden Memories, because while there was a bit of a random chance in this system, you still get a much better idea of what you can win from your opponent's decks, not have to worry about a ranking system, plus you can get at most 3 cards, although regrettably you won't be able to get duplicates when you do get one of each. But if you manage to get all 3 of the same card, you get a jackpot and can get a bonus card. I mean, I suck at this minigame, so you won't be seeing this happening with me, but I figured I'd just bring it up. After beating Taya, we're given a red rose card. The goal of the game is to get all 10 red rose and white rose cards, and luckily for us, we're immediately given a full set depending on which route we're using. This is where I think a third path could have been done, a renegade path where you fight both sides, maybe make it a more difficult route for players who want to take on each of the duelists with stronger decks. Oh well. After this, we face off against T. Tristan Gray and his crab walker strategy. Oh god, this can only be fun. So how long did this duel take me?
You stink, loser.
I won't be going into full detail with every duelist we face since I actually respect the finite time you have on this earth, but sometimes the AI in the game isn't the best. There are times where Tristan will throw his monsters into yours, even when they're faced up and have more attack points than his monsters. Congratulations, Tristan! You're still the most useless character in Yu-Gi-Oh! Hooray! I'm pushing you to the sandbox and stealing your wallet later. Since we're not going to talk about the duel itself, since his deck has no actual cohesion, let's talk about deck costs. When you're about to face an opponent, you'll see that they have a number between their name and portrait. Each card in the game has a number in it, and each time you include the card in your deck, the deck cost increases. If your DC is higher than an opponent's, you can't duel them. The game gives the excuse that you can't take the rose card from your opponent if your DC is higher than theirs. And while it's a good idea for a campaign, you can't really challenge them once you get the bigger and better cards without including absolute trash in your deck to balance out the numbers. Look, I just don't want to run 3 fake traps in my deck. They suck! This was put into the game to prevent players from completely dominating their opponent, but as we've seen with Tristan, a higher DC doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more challenging opponent. Frankly speaking, the fact I had to put garbage into my deck just to have a cohesive strategy and match the DC is a bit more challenging. Now, the duel after this, oh yeah, this is where things get a little tough. We're facing against Mai. And if you're like me, you're about to get slapped down by quite a few ladies with feathers and whips. And to some people that'll be a wet dream, of course, but against Mai it's more like a pain in the ass. which still might be to that dream, I guess. This is where we're going to be talking a bit more of the terrain aspect, since Mai here happens to have a pretty stacked up terrain on the board with mountains. You see, with terrain, there are monsters who gain advantage or disadvantage with this. What I mean is, monsters with advantage will get 500 extra attack points and defense points while on the field, and that gives them advantage, and will also gain the ability to move 2 squares instead of 1. Thankfully, the only real disadvantage that monsters get is a power decrease of 500 to their attack and defense. It'd be pretty stupid if your monsters couldn't actually move on the board if it was the wrong terrain. To use the example on hand, Mai uses a lot of dragon and winged beasts in her deck, and the field has a lot of mountain terrain tiles. One thing I should point out is that the terrain that is used for combat is the one where the attacked monster is happening. So if you, for example, have a monster on a mountain terrain and your opponent's monster is on a wasteland terrain and your monster is the one attacking, the calculation would take place on the wasteland terrain. Gonna be straight up, terrain is probably the most busted and important aspect of the gameplay, to the point where if you have a few field spells, you can use them to make your monsters gain advantage, take away your opponent's advantage, and you'll have a much better chance of winning. Which is a shame because Mai here has a pretty interesting strategy. For those familiar with Yugioh and the character, she uses Harpy Ladies, a rather popular archetype for no real reason, I guess. But let me explain. Mai's ace monster is Harpy's Pet Dragon, a 2000 attacker that gains 500 while in the mountain field. Not to mention, each time a Harpy Lady is flipped face up, her pet dragon gains 300 more attack points. 900 if Mai gets Harpy Lady's sisters out. Not to mention, Mai has a good number of traps in her deck. Acid Trap Hole, Invisible Wires, Mesmeric Control, and Shadow of Eyes that can destroy your monsters or prevent you from going into defensive positions. Not to mention, she has a number of powerful spell cards. Monster Reborn to get back monsters from her graveyard, Harpy's Feather Duster to take care of your spells and traps, and tons of spell cards that can boost her monsters really easily. She has an actual strategy to her deck and makes excellent use of the field. I only got lucky by drawing my Wasteland Field spell card early so she couldn't utilize the terrain to her advantage. And even then, she was able to get out her ace and only won by attacking her directly, which is something I hate doing since that makes it harder for you to get more cards. In order to continue the path we're on, we're going to have to take a boat, and we meet a freaky fish guy, and after getting on his boat, we... Damn, that's a kick-ass tune! Oh yeah, there's an element to the game that I think should be praised indefinitely, and that's the music. The song you're listening to is called Mako, Mercenary of Brentagne. It only plays one time in the entire game, and that's during this cutscene with Mako. The music is amazing and has this really epic feeling to it, which is kind of a shame that it's only regulated to this. Then there's Seto's Arrival, the music that was playing when Seto showed up to recruit you. It really helps illustrate the point that this character is powerful and also foreboding that he could probably crush you under his heel if he wanted to. And I mean, at that point in the game, if you could duel Seto, he would crush you since you'd only have access to the actual structured deck without any additional cards to add to it. Speaking of Seto, his theme when you face him one-on-one, which I know, spoilers for a game that doesn't actually have a story, really fits the situation. It's got the spectacular and classical motif to it that gives you the motivation to fight with all your might against his opponent who's willing to do whatever it takes in order to fulfill his goals. And later on, Yugi Henry Tudor VII, his theme comes to play. Since you were supposed to be on his side, it sounds mythical with desperation since, well, you were summoned to fight him, and now you're essentially just giving Yugi the middle finger about this. Sorry, Pharaoh. A lot of the music, however, is a bit of a remix from previous Yu-Gi-Oh games, like especially Forbidden Memories, which was already known for a lot of the awesome music, but you also have works for a few themes here, which are used for the final boss, and each version of the boss you fight uses a different theme and is dependent on which route you took. If there's one thing that I'll give this game, it's the music is done perfectly and fits well with the characters. If I had one issue, it's that the same tunes for each route and duel are the same, save for Seto and Yugi's battle themes for their respective duels. The song we're talking about at the beginning of this section is just used for the cutscene where the boat just goes around in a curve. I would have really appreciated if the song was actually used against Mako, since he's an outsider from the conflict, and as such, it'd only be appropriate for him to stand out more with his musical choice. It just sucks that this track of his doesn't get used again, and when you complete the campaign, you can't really access this music in the game unless you start over. And as far as I know, you can't really get your hands on this track. I know I'm about to go into a tangent, but when we talk about video game soundtracks, they often get left to the wayside. I personally would love it if video games nowadays came with CDs or add their music tracks to the mix when you buy them. I mean, if we're paying about $70 right now, you might as well give me a great deal for how much I'm paying, you know? Oh yeah, we're talking about the Freaky Fish guy. How's that going? Oh. Don't get the wrong idea. I'm not saying Mako is a terrible opponent to fight in the game. If anything, he's probably one of the better duelists on the Yorkist route. This is due to the cards he has, like Aqua Dragon, Roaring Ocean Snake, and Kyoryushin. These cards can change the terrain, with the former two changing the terrain into ocean whenever they battle an opponent's monster, and the latter changing all spaces within the range of one space into a sea when it's flipped up. Sea decks can be some of the strongest decks in the game, especially if Aqua Chorus is used in this, which can power up all water monsters on the field by 600 points. I'm not going to go super in depth with every duel, cause that'd just be repetitive, and I'm sure I've already tanked my watch time effectively enough right now. And our next opponent really isn't all that notable, which sucks cause it's the fan favorite that is Joey Wheeler, the character who was arguably the fourth most important character in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! And a fan favorite.
I'm gorgeous, I'm such a great duelist, I love me!
Oh well. What I'm trying to do is focus on the new mechanics that we can talk about when it comes to the duels, and which one will be the best to showcase these mechanics. So, we're going to Paris, and who's next but...
Flappin' Flotsam, what's that?
Oh boy. That ain't good. Oh my god, they made Shoddy into the Archbishop. It's Catholic Shoddy. This isn't like Persona 1 where they made the Japanese kid black and did some offensive stereotypical things with him. I'm just gonna point out that other characters like just Ishtar, keep her skin tone, which is kinda odd, while Shoddy doesn't. Like, this is a game where you have Henry Tudor with the starfish hair. I think you can keep Shoddy's skin the same. This is a 20-year-old game, no use complaining about this now, not like Konami cares. What we can complain about is the new kind of terrain introduced in this, the Crush Card terrain. Most people who are familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise will probably remember that one of the Kaiba's most famous combos was the Crush Card Virus, which could kill any and all monsters in the duelist deck with 1500 or more attack points. Something like that in a normal game would have been super overpowered. And if you ask some people nowadays, that would actually be pretty good. However, since the original Crush Card was changed from the broken manga and anime counterpart, there's also a change to this version of Crush Card. It's actually a terrain, and any monster with 1500 more attack points that crosses it will get destroyed automatically. There are some ways around this though. The first is like most other terrains, this one can be overwritten by spells or abilities. The second is to use immortal cards. They're a special kind of monster card that are immune to the Crush Card field, and when they die, they turn the adjacent squares into crushed terrain. A lot of immortal cards are actually some cards that weren't all that great in the original card game, save for Slate Warrior, who was a good beat stick with some fun effects. But if you want an example of the absurdity of this, Shape Snatch was a powerful card. Yes, Shape Snatch, one of the biggest jokes in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Joy.
Tell him to go eat shit, Johnny.
Garbage aside, there's one other aspect to Shoddy here that I want to touch on, and it's something that I didn't really see, but it has to do with the deck leader. You see, deck leaders can gain abilities. If you're familiar with the Deckmaster system for one of the filler arcs of Yugioh, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I'll go into more detail in a little bit, but know that your own deck leader doesn't have the abilities to start with, but can gain them. But it's a pain and a half to get them if you're just playing the game regularly. After Shoddy, we're about to tackle Grandpa Tudor. And he's got one of the worst AIs in strategy that you can think of in this game. So here's the setup for Jasper Dice Tudor here. He's got a castle and a very special kind of terrain, Labyrinth. This terrain prevents any monster from crossing it, save for a few that actually allow you to do so. And unlike other terrains, this can't be changed by terrain changing abilities or spells, save for one. Normally this wouldn't be an issue, but Dice Tudor here is running an Exodia deck. And if you know anything about Exodia and Yu-Gi-Oh!
Exodia! Obliterate!
Yeah, that ain't good. Or so you would think. The way to access Exodia is absurd. This is an instant win condition, and in Duelists of the Roses, it's a bit different. It's not exactly a matter of drawing the cards. No. You have to play the cards on the field, and you need to have Exodia as your deck leader. And the pieces of Exodia need to be adjacent to the deck leader, and they have to be face up. So in order to supplement this, Jasper Dice Tudor happens to have a number of cards that spellbind your own cards. What's spellbinding, you may ask? Essentially, it's a means to freeze your cards in place. They can't move, they can't change battle position, and most of the time these cards will be spellbound for only a few turns, but there are times where it will be permanent as long as the card is on the field. There are two ways that cards can be spellbound. The first is by effects, something that a good number of spells and traps can do, and the second is attribute spellbinding. Basically, if you attack a monster, keep an eye on the attribute of them. For example, if a light monster destroys a dark monster, if the light monster wins the fight, they get spellbound. And if a fire monster defeats a water monster, same thing. Wind beats up earth, BAM! I think you get the point. Throw in the fact that Jasper here has a burn strategy with enough cards that can inflict damage to beat you. Jasper has way too much annoyance with his turtle strategy. What makes it worse is that even if you're a huge Exodia fan, the rewards from Jasper aren't all that great, since most of the time you're not going to get the same setup that Jasper has, and getting the cards right to pull this off isn't worth it. Shame, because the animation for Exodia rocks. The next duelist is Bakura, who takes the role of Jack Cade. But since Jack Cade died before this game even takes place, and since this duel sucks, we'll just ignore this loser. Way to treat one of Yu-Gi-Oh's antagonists. Oh well, into the trash you go. Finally, we're facing against Henry Tudor, the villain of this story. I mean, the guy did summon me because his duelists suck. Joke's on you, Yugi. I was secretly evil! Yugi's duel is a fair bit more complicated, since there's a lot of different terrains to it, and as such, it makes it a little more difficult to plan strategies, but it's also where we can finally talk about deck leaders. Deck leaders can have abilities, however, in order to get those abilities, you need to be able to rank up your deck leader. So, how do you do that? Well, this is something that the game never actually tells you, but there's an experience system to your monsters. Monsters can gain experience in a number of ways, destroying monsters in battle, defending against attacks, and being on the field. Also, winning a duel allows your current deck leader to gain some experience. But you can also lose experience. If a monster gets sent to the graveyard, being a prime example. A good strategy to do is to have multiple copies of a card you want to level up and trap your opponent so they don't have enough room to move between two squares, but that would be too scared to play a card. Then you just waste time with your cards on the field to gain EXP. Ultimately, you'll want to be able to get as many copies of your Deckmaster on the field to do that. Oh, right, the duel itself. Well, here's the thing. Yugi is actually kind of competent, most of the time. The guy's got a lot of OP spells and traps. For example, Mirror Force, which if activated, will blow up all your attack position monsters and spell and trap cards.
Too late, Weeble. You already ordered your attack on my Dark Magician, and Mirror Force will deflect it right back at you.
He also has Brain Control, a spell that allows Yugi to take control of the highest attack monster that you have. So if you happen to have a powerful monster on the field, make sure it's not right next to you so it can hit you. And would you look at that, we managed to defeat the English. God bless the Queen. I think I screwed that up with my time codes, but whatever. With that, we've managed to steal the Red Rose card, so it's time to go home. Back to Stonehenge. Alright, Seto, we're back. What's the plan here? Is this who you wanted to summon, Seto? God, what the hell is up with them horns? This is Manawadam Fable. I don't know. I tried. To make a long story short, Seto summoned a Celtic god, and to top it off, it turns out Dark Knight from Forbidden Memories is his brother, and he is pissed that he got sealed away by humans. Well, look, buddy, I don't know if you know this, but those humans are in ancient Egypt, and they're dead. I ain't doing nothing like this. Oh well, he's still hell-bent on destroying all humans. Gee, thanks, Seto. You could have at least sent me back home before you summoned this jackass. So, Manny here is probably one of the more difficult fights in the game. Not only does he have a lot of powerful monsters like Meteor Black Dragon, Blue Eyes White Dragon, the Gate Guardian components, and Zoa, he also has some pretty busted spell cards. One of the most broken in the entire game would be Ryoku, a spell card that halves your life points and gives that to all the monsters he has as attack points. The one weakness of this guy is that it takes a lot longer for him to set up his monsters since they require a lot of stars in order to get out onto the field. For example, if he wanted to get Sangha of the Thunder out, he'd have to wait a turn to play it since he only has 4 stars to start off with. He'd have to wait another turn to play that and gain 3 stars, but then he'd run out of stars and have to build it up again. So while he had a powerful monster, it gives you a shot to build up your forces and rush him, especially since there's a Yami field. So if you can get another fiend or spellcaster out that's relatively powerful, you should be able to what's happening?
Do you think the Honorable Common would even lend an ear to your ridiculous proposal?
Huh? What just happened? Oh, right, I want to get back to my own time, and do that I need to help the Landcasters, so I'll take the red rose. Why does this feel like deja vu? After Seto for some reason takes this really well and allows us to leave, we actually meet Henry Tudor, who's grown tired of his name and took the name Yugi. For some reason. After that, we're heading back to the mainland to fight the White Rose Crusaders. For the glory of England! Now, this is something fun. If you pick the Red Rose route, you actually have more freedom against your opponents. You can choose who you want to fight. Man, it'd be a real bummer to have choice at the beginning of the game and then make it super linear for a path like that, don't you think? It'd just be super hollow and show that the choices really didn't matter. Good thing that didn't happen, right guys? You know, I don't remember having all these cards. I'm not gonna complain. Let's start off with Rex. We'll save Bug Boy for later. Rex happens to be one of the better opponents to start off with, since a lot of his strategy is mostly a frontal assault on your deck leader, mostly relying on the terrain of Wasteland to power up his dino. He has a relatively high DC, so you can take advantage with that and have a decent sized deck and... oh, wait. I didn't talk about DC yet, so DC, one of the strategies that's best in the game is to take advantage of your opponent's field terrain. My starter deck is one of machines, and as such, they get a boost on the wasteland terrain, while Rex does have the spell cards that can destroy him. That never really stopped me from trouncing his dinos. And as much as I would love to say that you can get some good cards from him, unfortunately dinosaurs in this game aren't really given the most love. Hell, it wouldn't be years later that dinosaurs would get really good in the original card game. Weevil, on the other hand, he's a bit more of a pain. Here's the thing about Weevil's strategy. While he's a lot more defensive, he has a lot more tricky cards, and he has access to one of the most broken cards in the entire game. Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth. This monster, aside from having some massive stats and can evolve from other monsters, has a nasty effect that can lower the attack of all your monsters by 100 points at the start of your turn. Weevil will often try to get it out by fusing a weak Moth monster with Cocoon of Evolution to make Larva of Moth. It has 0 attack and 2000 defense and is immobile, but from this moment on, the clock is ticking and you have 3 turns to kill it before it becomes Pupa of Moth. If this happens, you have 1 turn where you can kill it and only have to deal with Great Moth, which still isn't great since it has the same effect as Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth and is still powerful, especially in the forest terrain. But if you fail to kill in time, you probably will lose. He will most often form his Larva of Moth in the corner of the map right next to his deck leader. He also tends to have a lot of powerful monsters in his deck that he can use to push you back. So if you're not prepared with your own strong monsters, he can plow through you easily. If you want my honest opinion, the Red Rose path is probably the more difficult of the 2 paths you can take. Not only do most of the duels on this side have more competent strategies, but they also have higher DCs to them. Well, most of them. Characters like Necromancer have a lower DC, which makes it a chore to slide out cards from a usual setup. And for what? A defensive duelist who has a lot of zombie monsters with zero defense. However, when you duel the guy, he actually is a deck leader with a few interesting abilities, one being the fact that he can power up its zombies monsters in addition to the terrain bonus that he gets. Not to mention he has a similar monster to the Weevil's Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, Pump King, the King of Ghosts, only instead of weakening your monsters, it powers up his zombies. He only has one though in his deck, however, this can make for an interesting strategy, especially if you want a zombie deck though. Especially you can get 3 copies of this pumpkin. But now we come to the more difficult portion of this side of the conflict. Darkness Ruler, Pegasus, and Keith. There's also Labyrinth Ruler, but his AI sucks, his deck sucks, and the only thing really going for him is the field on since it winds around Labyrinth, so that sucks too. Let's talk about the 3 beforehand, because they actually have some interesting strategies going on and don't suck with their AI. Darkness Ruler, as a lot of people will see the design and remember the iconic Panic from the original Yu-Gi-Oh anime, his video game counterpart actually reflects his defensive strategy pretty well. He has the Yami terrain all over the field and has his Castle of Dark Illusions, which allows him to power up his Fiend monsters by 500 points, while in defense mode. He also has a lot of trap cards that can induce the spellbinding effect on your monsters, and he'll lay them out all over his deck leader. And to make matters worse, he has some of the more permanent spellbinding effects, especially Gorgon's Eye. A lot of people remember this card from the Pegasus duel against Yami Yugi. Its real life card effect is pretty paltry. In fact, it's impractical to use. But in this game, it's probably one of the more broken cards, especially since it does permanently bind your monster in attack position if you decide to end its turn in defense mode. In my humble opinion, this is where the game really shines and shows its potential to be a great strategy RPG, especially considering that the AI each have their own unique strategies, just some more than others. So let's talk about Keith. Although I think Keith here is a bit of a time traveler, I know it'd be sacrilege for him wearing the iconic Stars and Stripes bandana, but the Union Jack wasn't a thing when this game supposedly takes place. Oh well. Keith does have quite a variety of cards that can mess up your day. Barrel Dragon, when flipped up, can destroy a monster of yours. Machine King gets 100 attack points for every machine in the field, so you can have a 3k attacker quite easily thanks to that, and the terrain. And Metal Zoa is just naturally a beat stick. Keith has the highest average attack monsters so far in the game, and it's best to face him with an ocean deck since a lot of ocean monsters thrive in the sea while machines just rust. However, if you're like me and haven't gone to the other path of the game yet, we should take this opportunity to show how there are other means of getting cards in the game. There's the one-time option where you can input a password on the deck screen. In order to do that, you just need to press down on the R3 button. This is how you can choose a good number of cards to get better cards in the game. However, there is a caveat, and one I don't really understand. Yu-Gi-Oh! Often has these numbers in the corner of their cards, so you'd think that you can take that number and plug it into the game and get that card, right? Nope! For some reason, they decided to add letters to the passwords. Kinda defeated the purpose of the codes on the cards, but whatever. There's lists out there that have the codes written, so if you're looking for a specific card, you can get that. Although not every card has a password, so be aware that some cards like Black Skull Dragon are cards you can't really get via password. The other method of getting cards is via reincarnation. By pushing the L3 button, you can take one of your spare cards and trash it to get 3 new ones. The higher your card's DC is, the better prizes you can get. It's a good way to recycle your cards you don't need, but you can only do it every 5 duels you participate in. It's a good idea if you want to do more with the cards you're not using and get some good stuff in return. The only issue is you can't do this all the time. I'm all there for being a cooldown period, but 5 duels seems a bit much. Having to do 1 duel would be enough in my opinion, but then again, I'm not the developers of this game, and if you did that every duel, considering how short the game is, it would be kinda busted. Getting out of character for a second, after I defeated Keith, I kept on whooping his ass so I can get more machine cards and get machine support cards. He's really the only character in the game that you can do that if you want to get a good machine deck. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's bad because there's a lack of variety in prizes against the opponents. If you're a new player to the game and you choose a starter deck that's, well, bad, you're not going to get a lot of cards to synergize with it. But on the good side, each opponent you face doesn't exactly copy each other, both in strategy and what cards they offer to you. It's actually refreshing since someone who does actually play the actual card game and who has gotten sick of seeing the same cards again and again and again played against me. Ugh. I honestly want to talk about that, but that's for the end. Right now, what I really appreciate is that each opponent has their own theme and set of cards. While there aren't too many opponents in this game, there's enough to be quite the variety, but there are plenty of cards that could be used for decks that aren't used. I understand there's only just so many duelists in the game that could be used, since this seems to only use characters from the Duelist Kingdom arc, but I feel like there could have been other characters you could have been using. Forbidden Memories had a lot of original characters that you could duel against. Why not do that here too? Without every card that can be a deck master as well as having multiple different cards, it could have had a few more opponents, but I will say that I appreciate the AI for the characters that don't really copy each other and do use their cards more confidently, so long as they're not using the crab walker strategy. There's a lot going on here with the strategies, and it's something that I can really get behind with this game. Speaking of, we got probably one of the toughest duelists in the game, Pegasus. Pegasus plays more defensively, but if you know anything about Pegasus, you know that his favorite type of monsters are tombs. His terrain has a castle theme to it, with Labyrinth acting as the gates with 2 entrances, but the real problem comes from the very unique terrain, the Toon terrain. You see, the Toon terrain powers up a select amount of monsters that are toons, and depowers everything else. So if you want to get to Pegasus, you need to get through that wall of toons to get powered up, and his monsters aren't pushovers while in this field. You want to go with your terrain changers? Like me, I have a copy of Curse of Dragon and Cyberstein, both of which change the terrain to Wasteland when they battle, but you can use others like Aqua Dragon. That's one way to get past his toon terrain, however his toons still have impressive stats. Take for example Bakuri Box. Normally this monster in the original game was unplayable because of it being a fusion monster, but here not only does he gain a boost from the toon terrain, but it's also a fiend, so if you use the Yami terrain it also gets a boost. He also has some of the nastiest traps in the game too, Spellbinding Circle and Mesmeric Control being examples, but his spell cards, those are the ones that can really get you hard. There's things like Change of Heart and Brain Control, which allow them to control your monsters, so make sure you keep them away from your deck leader so they don't get a hit on you, like they did with me. He also has Tremendous Fire, one of the better burn cards in the game that can hit you for 1,000 points of damage. And then there's Mimicat. It can fetch any card from either graveyard, no matter what. And if you have dragons, well, you're boned. He's got dragon capture jars that can eternally spellbind your dragons. Pegasus can be a tricky customer, and hey, I actually did lose him the first time I replayed this game for this review because I had forgotten about his monster stealing spells. And you wanna know the worst part? The guy doesn't even have a rose card! So we get to duel Ishtar to get that card, and frankly, she's not really one to talk about. She doesn't really have that much of an interesting deck, nor field, nor any real mechanics that I can really talk about. Of course, once we do beat her, we get the second to last white rose card. So all that's left is... War. And oh shit, it's Haitian, the main antagonist for Forbidden Memories. Oh man, Haitian was a powerful opponent with some of the strongest cards in the original PS1 game, and here he's whack, whack, whack. Well, thanks for wasting my time, dick. Get it? Here he's Richard, and forget. I'm glad you're dead at the end of this single cutscene. And here we go against the actual penultimate duel of this path, Seto. Unfortunately, due to some issues, my footage for this and the last duel of the game got corrupted. And I don't feel like recording all that again, so, sorry? He's probably as strong as Pegasus, but has a more aggressive strategy, especially since he has the Blue Eyes White Dragon. Duh. But that doesn't mean his strong monsters make the game. However, he happens to have a fun deck leader ability that makes things a little more complicated. You see, he has the ability to reduce the summoning cost for his monsters. Granted, for some reason, I have these cards in my deck that allow me to challenge his monsters easily, but at least he's a fair but more competent than other duelists. But in comparison to the next guy, well, after he beats Seto, he's humbled. Well done, duelist. I may have lost, but my heart sings with the joy of having faced you in battle. 'Twas a duel to be remembered. I take great pride in the fact that I fall by your hand. And if you believe that, I'll sell you some swampland in the outer reaches of the realm! As it turns out, we did exactly what Seto wanted. He needed all 16 rose cards there to unleash Manny, but nothing says he has to be in the physical possession of them all, so it didn't matter to him which side gathered the cards. Hell, it didn't matter if he won or lost, he was able to accomplish his goals regardless. It makes sense why he let you go earlier in the story, since you did all the legwork for him, and immediately got all the red rose cards without any trouble. Huh. If it wasn't for Manny betraying Seto, this honestly would make the guy one of the more impressive antagonists in gaming. Of course, every plan has a kink to it, and Manny here ain't all that thrilled being summoned, and anyone else getting deja vu? Manny here on the Red Rose path is arguably more difficult version of the character to duel. That DC of 1985 should tip you off to that, since his strategy is filled with offensive burn damage. While his monsters aren't great, the fact that he uses the crush card terrain in the middle of the plane makes it so your stronger monsters don't get there unless you make it inside with a different terrain. Although that wouldn't help too much since he has 3 mirror forces, he's got Gorgon's eyes so you can't defend against that, and he's got Ryoku which can halve your life points. His strategy is to burn you down while removing your best cards. But eventually, after some trouble, you defeat him and... Depending on which route you take, you get a different ending. If you side with Yugi, well, you get screwed over. Yugi has treated you like garbage. He has you summoned to the 14th century against your will to duel a bunch of people and get their rose cards. You help him become King of England by usurping Richard III's throne, who, technically speaking, did nothing to you but challenge you to a friendly children's card game. Yugi takes credit for what you did and then erases your name from history. And you're stuck in this time period. He's supposed to be the good guy, right? Now, if you joined with Seto, it actually proves that he was the true protagonist of this game. We learned that the guy was trying to claim his family's birthright, and says that most of the time when he summons the wrong card guardian, he deals with it himself. Nice. Honorable. The only reason why you had to fight the card guardian was because legend stated that we were supposed to do so. Again, this is supposed to be you. You're the duelist of the roses. And to top it off, Seto actually rewards you. He gives you a coat of arms that you can show to guarantee his family's debt to you, and he actually returns it to your own time. That ungrateful bastard Yugi couldn't be bothered to do that much. Again, who's the villain of this game? And that's the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelists of the Roses. After you defeat both sides, you essentially just get a map showing all the opponents so you can duel again at your heart's content. And unfortunately, while there's no reason why you should, since you have all the rose cards, you can't duel them because if you have a higher DC, you're prevented from doing so. At this point though, you're just doing this for fun and trying to get cards. There's no story, there's no bonus content. It just sucks. I want to be clear on something. I love this game, and I have sung a lot of its praises, but I've also talked about a lot of its issues as well. I've talked about the AI, and sometimes the AI can be so stupid it'll continuously activate traps that you have on the field that are permanent. The best examples are Mirror Wall and Goblin Fan that can easily make your opponent hurt themselves in the process. And a number of monster types are pretty much screwed over. Dinosaurs only have normal monsters with nothing stronger than 2200 attack points, and the best types in the game are zombies, insects, machines, and the ocean-based monsters. They all have great effects and utility and have great stats. So frankly, it really makes the game unbalanced since there are objectively better monster types. The lack of an actual post-game or even a third path really hold the game back from its potential. And here's something I need to talk about and bring up in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game. So back in the heyday of Yu-Gi-Oh! It was considered a rival of Pokemon, and hey, at one time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the most popular game of all time. However, the one thing that set Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Apart, even nowadays, is that while Yu-Gi-Oh! Was popular, it really has only one format to play nowadays. Let me put it like this, Pokemon had a ton of spin-offs. If you got tired of playing the mainline games, you could play the card game, or take up some of the side games that played with the IP. And that's something that's still happening to this day with Pokemon. Complain about them all you want, I won't blame you for that, except if you talk about trees. But Pokemon is still making new content, and is at least varying it up with their games and such. Yu-Gi-Oh! On the other hand doesn't really have that aspect to them. We used to with games like Duelists of the Roses since it had its own meta to it. Regardless of being a mess, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a high bar if you want to get into the game now. Costs for cards are extraordinary, especially if you want to play competitively. And even Master Duel isn't above this now. It's part of the reason why I quit playing Master Duel, and totally not me smashing my fist through the monitor of how bullshit the game could be with some of its choices. But games like Duelists of the Roses played around with the concept of Yu-Gi-Oh! And considering that we're dealing with Konami now, the devil who has stolen my heart and soul, it feels like all the fun from the games were taken away, and I swear to God, if someone brings up speed dueling, I prefer to use the cards I already spent years collecting without having to spend even more money on a format that is essentially dead. And don't get me started on rush duels, I'm not even touching on that. So, while Duelists of the Roses is far from perfect, it certainly does scratch a niche that I wouldn't be able to have nowadays. And hey, there are people who are modding the game. There's actually quite a few mods out there that do extend the content, and I'll probably mention a few in the future if anyone's interested. But hey, that's just me. I like Duelists of the Roses, but it's far from a perfect game. But it's one that I hold in my heart because, well, It was fun to play as a kid. Anyway, that's just me. I'm MangaKamen, and thanks for watching. Let's duel. Let me propose a question to you all. What is difficulty? I realize this is an odd question, especially in the world of gaming, but how many times can you recall a journalist saying that games require an easy mode? And how often do you remember when such a thing that was offered that the public would backlash against it? It's a bit of an odd internet tug-of-war topic that crops up every few years. I personally believe that when it comes to difficulty selections, that games can have them, but they aren't a requirement.
Oh, blast it!
As a creator myself, I can respect the choices of game developers for choosing to or not include different difficulties. Gaming isn't a one-size-fits-all, because while anyone can get into any game, that doesn't mean that every game has to be for everyone.
I see you stopped touching yourself long enough to learn how to play this thing.
Now, you're probably wondering why I'm bringing this up in a video about a Yu-Gi-Oh game. When we think of difficulty, we think of stats, strategies, and whatever else you can think of when it compromises the challenges of a game that can give you. However, for a game for the Game Boy Advance, today's topic is probably one of the toughest games out there. Not just in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it isn't because of any preset difficulty that the game has, but rather how much the game stacks the deck against you, in numerous ways. This is Yugioh, Reshef of Destruction.
Reshef of Destruction.
Like most video game essayists, you're probably wondering what Reshef of Destruction is. Well, back in the day of the early 2000s, Yu-Gi-Oh's gaming scene was starting to pick up. Most people are familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh games are with Forbidden Memories or Duels of the Roses, both games I've covered on this channel which you can check out later. But Yu-Gi-Oh back then had a lot of experimentation with its games. Sometimes with the official card game itself, but also expanding into other games like Dungeon Dice Monsters, The Falsebound Kingdom, or the actual RPGs of the series. What's that? Yu-Gi-Oh had RPGs? Why, yes they did, my friends. There were two games that you consider to be full-on RPGs, the Sacred Cards and Reshef of Destruction, the two being connected with Reshef being a pseudo-sequel to Sacred Cards, acting as a bit of an alternative to Season 4 of Yu-Gi-Oh! So here's a thought. Why am I not covering Sacred Cards? Logically speaking, I should talk about that one first, since it came out first, and has a number of similar mechanics to Reshef of Destruction. It's also technically the first Yu-Gi-Oh RPG, which when I say that, allows you to control an actual sprite on the field, rather than being a completely faceless mook like in Duelists of the Roses, or being the Pharaoh in Forbidden Memories. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because the Sacred Cards is honestly a pretty weak game. Story, challenge, and even in the dialogue. You see, Sacred Cards is pretty much what the iconic Battle City story arc is, and then it scoops out anything that really made the storyline interesting, especially since in order for there to be a player character insert, they basically stole all of Joey Wheeler's opponents, Esparoba, Weevil, and Mako Tsunami, and effectively turning the underdog into a whimpering puppy dog. Such disrespect for the godfather of games. There's also the fact that most of the opponents in the game don't really have that strong of decks, with the exception of Yami Merrick, who served at the final boss. Yeah, even Kaiba isn't all that strong of an opponent. Again, such disrespect. So, if you ask me, it's a game that belongs in the trash. Reshef, on the other hand, expands upon the lore of the series, has the enemy duelist decks be dangerous, and is actually an interesting topic of discussion when it comes to difficulty in games. But it does turn Yugi and Joey into their own personal cheerleaders throughout the story, since it isn't until a few key moments that they actually do anything really in it. And depending on the day and how far I am in the game, I may even tell you that Reshef of Destruction is my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh game, or it's a game that I want to throw out the window. That's because the developers may have actually heard people's complaints about how easy the Sacred Cards was, and decided to make Reshef one of the worst jumps in difficulty in gaming I've seen, especially for a sequel. I know I can't prove that's what the developers were intending, since there's not even an official Wikipedia article about this game, but there just seems to be a fair amount of spite set behind this game's difficulty and design choices that make my head spin. Which is a shame, because while it doesn't have the deepest storyline in gaming, from a character perspective, Reshef takes a good chunk of pre-existing characters in Yu-Gi-Oh! And plays around with them. If you only look at the Yu-Gi-Oh! Games that I've covered on this channel up to this point, Forbidden Memories and Duelists of the Roses, there's a lot more character and story-wise emphasized with Reshef of Destruction. Granted, it's not like we're getting a deep dive into the psyche of Weevil Underwood, but it feels more like an actual RPG where you can talk to the duelists from the original anime, duel against them, and you can see some other things about the characters that aren't really expressed in the anime or manga. And I think that's the best way you can do with established characters from an official IP without making them completely different characters. However, I think we spent enough time rambling, let's actually talk about the game itself. Our story begins with some odd imagery of a weird being, the 3 Egyptian god cards being turned to stone, and then 7 weird lights scatter across the globe. Finally, we see a familiar face amongst the flames, with that weird being beforehand. He looks familiar, but he's obviously different. Gee, I wonder who this fabulous person could be. We then cut to Joey and the player character working on their decks. And one thing to note is the dialogue that Joey has. Now I put this monster guy in here like so. There was actual effort to at least ascribe the Brooklyn accent that Joey's character has in the dub, and there are other characters with similar mannerisms. And it's because of things like this that I was able to hear the OG 4Kids voice actor speaking while playing this game. I personally think that when it comes to characters talking like this, that it's good writing. Not everyone in the world talks the same, most people don't use proper grammar and everyday lingo. Me certainly don't. I have my own tics, I'm sure you've heard a few of them while listening to my videos, and even in this own script I've got some. My point is, let the Godfather of Games do his thing.
The Godfather of Games, capiche?
Capiche? Back to the story, Joey asks us how our deck is coming along. And it's terrible, since this game will go out of its way to give you the worst cards imaginable for your starter deck. Man, this stinks! You're telling me, Joey. It's at this point that Yugioh comes rushing into our room, exclaiming that all the Millennium items, along with the puzzle and the Spirit of the Pharaoh, have disappeared. Aha! Those were the 7 lights that we saw earlier in the opening. It's here that I want to point something else out. The pixel art in this game is pretty decent, especially for a Game Boy Advance game. The in-game sprites do a good job of showcasing the characters, and you can tell who's who because of it quite easily. But the portraits are where the game really shines. They look good, especially when you can see details like the tears on Yugioh's face as he tells you the bad news here. I am playing this game on an emulator to get footage, so there is going to be some blur going on the screen. It's blown up on a PC, what do you expect? And you can see this happening in the pre-rendered backgrounds here. But for a handheld game in 2004, it looks good. After promising Yugioh that will help him, we decide to go to the clock tower?
I wonder what time it is.
It's here we explain what's going on to Taya, but as we're talking, a Shizu appears from behind the bush going, I couldn't help but overhear. Girl, how long were you waiting behind that bush for us? It's here that Shizu pretty much dumps the entire plot of the game here. How there's an ancient evil being called Reshef, the Dark Being, who's going to destroy the world. And in order to stop this ancient evil, we need to free the god cards who were turned to stone by Reshef. How do we do this? Well, we have to find the Millennium items that were scattered across the globe. And yes, we're the ones who have to find them, but unfortunately, we quickly becomes me since we're the only one who's really dueling in this situation. Even when there's a tag match, tag dueling isn't a thing in this game, so yeah, it's just me doing this. So Shizu just dumps this on me, the player. But who are you in this world? Well, you're obviously the most popular character in the world. A practically voiceless, faceless, and the most interesting person in the Yugioh-verse. You. Yeah, this is kind of on tier with fanfiction writing and some people have called it out, but there is a bit of a charm to it too. I am not against the idea of self-insert characters in these games. Hell, Duels of the Roses didn't even bother to give you an actual character design. At least here we got this thing. I do wish we could have had a little customization going on with our design, but again, early 2000 Game Boy Advance game. But that's the plot here. The main one at least. A search for the MacGuffins and unlocking the god cards to fight against a being that wants to destroy the world. From that description, it sounds like a standard plot for our JRPGs, especially for Yu-Gi-Oh! But the strength of Reshef's writing comes from the characters and the side plot content that the game offers. Take, for example, Weevil. I brought it up slightly in the last section, but there is a point in the games where you have to find duelists to help fight against the rare hunters who take over Domino City, where they're attacking the duelists and stealing their cards. And as such, we need to find powerful duelists to help fight against them. One of those duelists is, of course, Weevil Underwood, one of the more antagonistic characters from the original manga and anime. Most people know him as a pretty big cheat in the series, where he was even willing to go so far to throw away Yugi's pieces of Exodia, or sabotage Joey's deck in Battle City. He was a lesser, more down-to-earth villain in the show, more related to the card game, and one of the reasons why I like the character is that he seems more real. He didn't have aspirations to destroy the world, he just wanted fame and money. And Duel Monsters was his ticket to it. I mean, look at how small he is. He ain't actually going to be winning any beauty contests. Not with those glasses. Now, while I'm not a fan of the cheating, Weevil was still an interesting character. And in this game, while he's not the nicest person, we do see inklings of him actually being Human? It makes sense when you think about it too. You, the player, aren't Yugi or Joey. You didn't beat Weevil in a major tournament. Well, unless you count Sacred Cards as canon in this, but the canon is all over the place with this game, so have you whatever. But you never really caused Weevil any embarrassment. You didn't knock him out of a tournament. Hell, he willingly gives the player character his best card, Insect Queen, when you need the spirit of a duelist later on. And when the game ends, he actually wants to see if you're okay. Although he'll deny it, saying he wants his card back. Little squirt. Again, it's not the deepest characterization, but there are plenty of other moments that stand out for the characters. Especially the side ones, who didn't get a lot of development in the main series. Take Bones, for example. Bones is the zombie duelist of the original Yu-Gi-Oh series. He used to work under Bandit Keith, the guy with the American flag on his head. And most people remember Bones from fighting Joey in Duelist Kingdom. Of course, in Duelist Kingdom, after Bones lost to Joey, Bandit Keith basically took whatever star chips Bones and his two other goons had, and beat them up in the process. And in Battle City,
You must all wander the Shadow Realm until I choose to set you free.
yeah! In this game, however, when Bandit Keith, who now becomes the leader of the Rare Hunters, or ghouls as it were, he has a goon confront Bones, and Bones actually stands up for himself against his former boss, refusing to join the ghouls and citing that Keith didn't respect him. I mean, I should hope so, he kicked your ass! There's also small things like Rex Raptor actually showing his affinity to dinosaurs extends to outside his dueling deck, with him actually going on an archaeological dig and finding actual fossils. These were all side characters in the anime and manga, and save for Weevil and Rex when they got roped in the Arikalkos Villa arc, where, that was kind of dropped after the whole thing and no one ever wanted to talk about how they basically lost whatever respect they had. And it's kind of refreshing to see all these characters that I grew up watching on the screen actually get more screen time. Actually expands upon their characters too. Hell, we even see Merrick, former villain of Battle City. We see him praying to his parents who passed away. Although, personally, considering his father, I don't know why you'd want to honor that bastard, but hey, you do you, Merrick. There are a ton of moments like this in this game, although some of the funniest moments belong to Kaiba, as he's usually there to insult the players and crew. Yeah, I wouldn't be laughing there, moneybags. In this game, your precious blue eyes can be toppled over by a Karibo. There's also some side content in the game that has some fun character moments thrown in too. Although you can miss these little beats if you don't check everywhere after you defeat a major duelist. One of my favorites would be when Duke and Tristan are trying to prove themselves as strong duelists to Serenity, Joey's little sister, and they start off by wagering a date with her via a duel. And of course, when Joey finds out, he threatens to kick both their asses. But when they learn that Serenity likes strong duelists like Mai, they go to her. And she's got them doing military training to become strong. And finally, when they go to Kybercorp to face off against their robotic duelists there, it calls them both idiots. For good reason, too. I mean, later on in the game, we learn that Duke and Serenity think Tristan turned into a robot monkey, when it turns out that he actually went to go get some food. Idiots. If you've seen my Forbidden Memories and Duelists of the Roses video, you'll know that one of my issues with both those games is that there's a lack of characterization and any actual story for them. While not every game needs to have the deepest story, it's the characters that can make things all the more fun. And neither one of those games really did it for me in that regard. They were more for the gameplay, and let's face it, when people talk about Forbidden Memories or Duelists of the Roses, they're more for the speedrunning or talking about the absurdity of them. But with Reshef? Well, I'm glad I can talk about the characters, even if they aren't the deepest characters, and trust me, there's a lot of stuff I'm not talking about with the story. It's not like it'll change your life, but there is a narrative here, and there are times where you can actually interact with the cast, and it's memorable. Besides, unlike Duelists of the Roses, at least Yugi doesn't leave your ass back in the actual War of the Roses when he summoned you and didn't have a way to get you back home. I'm still not over that. Fuck you, Henry Tudor. However, there's a shadow over Reshef of Destruction, a shadow that loves to essentially gatekeep that content, and unfortunately, it's the gameplay and difficulty. Sacred Cards and Reshef of Destruction are an interesting combination of the actual rules of Yu-Gi-Oh, as well as having elements of the previous games that I've mentioned already. One of the biggest changes is that you can play more than one card a turn, though you can normally only summon one monster from your hand. There are exceptions, but we'll get to those later. At the beginning of each duel, both players start with 5 cards in their hand. No more, no less. You see, if you have 5 cards in your hand, you don't draw from your deck, which is actually really important, especially for me, but again, we'll get to that later. During each player's turn, each player can summon a monster and play any and all spell and trap cards on the field. If you know basic Yu-Gi-Oh, you know how this game plays. The only difference between this game and the real one is that there's no extra deck, no fusion, and most of the cards in the game are absolute garbage, and you're forced to use them. So here's something you can understand, and it's gameplay mechanic that has branched off from Forbidden Memories. And that's the type system. Stuff like fire, water, fiend, dreams, etc. Every monster will have a type to it along with its monster type. And it's a rock, paper, scissors mechanic. Only, unlike in Forbidden Memories with the guardian symbols, they gave your monster a boost of 500 if it was a strong guardian star. Here, it's a lot simpler with the elements. For the most part, and instead of a boost, it just pops the monster. It's why a Blue Eyes White Dragon can lose to a Karibo. It's also why most of the double tributed monsters aren't really worth the effort, since unless they have a divine typing which has no weakness, these big boys can lose immediately to small monsters if they have the right type. Water defeats fire, electricity defeats water, earth defeats electricity, wind beats up earth, forest takes the lunch money of wind, and fire just burns down forests. Shadow defeats light, dream craps on shadow, fiend beats up dream, and light defeats fiend. It can be a little bit confusing, especially with that second typing ring, but it makes a lot more sense than the Guardian Stars, since those had to use the planets and didn't have the actual elements. And it can make some having weaker cards in your deck more useful in case you're facing an opponent that has a clear singular type to them. For example, and at one point when you face against Mako a few times in order to get some grinding in, using Thunder cards is optimal against him because he usually mostly just has water types. Or if I'm facing against My Valentine, most of her monsters are wind, so including a healthy amount of forest cards is a good suggestion since a lot of her monsters have a good attack stat and get a percentage bonus from the field that she starts on. Still show some other types, so it's not a good idea to go all in with a singular type. And here's the fun thing, if your monster has a super effective type and has a lower attack score, you won't lose any life points, but the attack stat is still higher and the loser will lose life points. There are 3 things we need to address that are extremely important to this game and how it ties into the difficulty: duelist level, deck capacity, and life points. You see, every card in the game that you add to your deck has a cost to it. If you remember Duelist of the Roses, you couldn't challenge an opponent who has a lower deck capacity than you, and that was determined by the card's deck costs. That's not a thing in this game. Rather, that's where Duelist level comes to play. You can not only add cards who have a higher deck cost than your Duelist level, but you can't even view the card. You're too weak to read a playing card. So I guess the stereotype of Yu-Gi-Oh players not reading their card effects had to come from somewhere, I guess. And here's the rub with all that. Even if you have a higher duelist level, you can't use a deck of cards that exceed your deck capacity. So you can't exactly cheese it at the beginning of the game with strong cards. You have to make your way up the food chain to get to that. So how do you increase your duelist level and deck capacity? Simple, just win duels. Every time you win a duel, whether it be against a faceless NPC or a character who's actually, important enough to have a customizable sprite, you'll not only win some domino, aka the money in this game that you can use to get new cards, but you also gain some additional points to your duelist level and deck capacity. Now, this is where I would go into the BS that comes into play, but we need to discuss that in the difficulty section, so let's talk about life points first. You see, in most games of Yu-Gi-Oh, when you have life points, they reset with every duel. But in Reshef, oh hell no, you don't get that luxury, pal. Whenever you finish a duel, you keep that life point counter into your next duel. But don't worry, there's a way to get those life points back. You just gotta go back to your house and interact with your computer. Your life points go up to 8k, and you can save your game at the same time. Or you could just include life point increased cards in your deck, but good luck with that. I want to stress that this is a very terrible saving system. I'm glad I was playing an emulator where I could do save states, but holy hell, going back to your room every single time you need to get a recharge of your life points is a very tedious aspect of this game. And people complained about Pokemon Colosseum and its save points. I will say that unlike in other games that have a similar issue to this, Reshef of Destruction actually doesn't have all these intricate dungeons, so you don't have to keep running through every single screen to get back to that, and the stage select isn't that terrible. It's still a bad design choice, don't get me wrong, but it could have been a lot worse. And your life points, it isn't usually a problem most of the time, since there aren't any long-spanning dungeons or random battles in the game, but there will be times where you have to face against multiple opponents, and you won't be able to run away to heal up. Normally, I wouldn't be a fan of this sort of thing, especially when it comes to a Yu-Gi-Oh game, and especially if that were done in real life, that would be so bullshit. But most of the time with RPGs, when you're out in the field, you don't have access to all healing, and you would have to rely on items to replenish your resources. And when it's against more gauntlets, this sort of thing in the kind of game, it makes the duels a bit more challenging. You have to actually think about whether or not you want to take some risks or not with your card choices, and you have to play a bit more conservatively at times. It's not the worst thing, but with a more polish, a system like this could work. If you could access your life point recovery cards outside of duels, but when you do, you use that card up and have to buy a new one, or you have to refresh it at your PC, something like that would be an idea, and there would still be times where you couldn't do anything between duels and have to continue along. It's not a broken idea, but it can be improved upon. There's also monster effects. There are two kinds of monster effects in the game: one-time use and continuous. When you summon a monster to the field, it's summoned face down in attack position, and while it's face down, you can select to activate its effect. These effects can do a variety of things, but my favorite are the ones that summon other monsters. Doron or Revival Gen can summon copies of themselves to the field, while things like Toadmaster can summon a Frog the Jam, and these cards that help give you some really good card advantage in the game. Another notable card to bring up is Trapmaster. It has an effect that can set an acid trap hole, a trap card that when your opponent attacks with a monster, so long as that monster doesn't have more than 3,000 attack points, it'll be destroyed. That's a good chunk of monsters that you'll be able to destroy. On a side note, for monsters like this, there's a spell card called Darkness Approaches. In the TCG, this card is straight up garbage. You have to discard 2 cards from your hand to change a monster to face down position. Not only is the cost way too much, but there have been better choices to do the same thing. Book of Moon is not only a card you can use during your opponent's turn because it's a quick play, but it has no cost. But in Reshef, not only does this card have a pretty low deck cost, so you can splash it into almost any deck, but you don't have to discard anything to use it, and can affect all of your monsters, meaning when you have effects that need to be manually activated, you can use them again. Although to point out, if you use the effect for that card this turn, you won't be able to use it again, even if you flip your monster face down, so heads up on that. But because of this, you can potentially use Revival Gem Splitting Effect, so you have 2 of them. Then on your next turn, use Darkness Approaches to flip them both face down. Then you can use both of their effects 2 more times to get more gems, giving you a total of 4. That is insane card advantage right here. The graveyard is also something you can use too. There are specific cards that can be used in tandem with it. 2 notable cards are Different Dimension Dragon and Darkflare Knight. Now in the TCG, again, these cards suck. They weren't that great in the old days and certainly aren't great now. Different Dimensions Dragon effect and stats weren't all that great, and Dark Flare Knight was a messy fusion monster that required not only a Dark Magician, but another fusion monster in Flame Swordsman. The cards don't really work together all that well, so they ain't good. But in this game, Dark Flare Knight is a monster you can have in your deck, but the moment that it hits the graveyard, it summons a Mirage Knight, a powerful 2800 beat stick, and you don't even need to have it in your deck. And when the turn passes, it summons out the Dark Magician and Flame Swordsman in its place. And here's the best part. You can choose to discard cards whenever you want from your hand from the menu option. So you drop Dark Flare Knight in the graveyard and you get that 2800 power boost. Different Dimension Dragon has a similar effect, but it revives itself on your next turn if it's in your graveyard. And to point out, you can only have 1 card in the graveyard at a time, so if you can prevent anything else from going in, Different Dimension Dragon will revive itself and you can use it for tribute summoning. And you can keep this effect going again and again. These effects can be used really effectively. Then there are continuous effects, and these are both the best and worst thing for the game. Continuous effects are something that were added for this game, and it was one of the first Yugioh games to include something like this. Some cards like Nightmare Penguin or Little Witch have abilities that can boost certain cards, or a card like Mammoth Graveyard can lower the attack points of all your opponent's monsters. Now, these sound like great card effects. Why would I say it's the worst thing in the game? It's because in order to make sure that the card effects go off, the game checks the entire field after every action you do. You draw a card, you play a monster, you activate a monster effect. You look in the mirror, contemplating that you just spent the last week and a half in a 20-year-old Yu-Gi-Oh game and God knows how long in the editing room, wondering if this is even worth it because YouTube is purposely gimping your videos. This programming choice adds so much fluff to the game, and throw in the fact that every time it reaches the card with a continuous effect, it has to tell you that the effect is active. Yes, I am aware that my Mammoth Graveyard is using its effect to lower the attack of my opponent's monsters. I don't need to be told everything. God forbid if your opponent has one of these things, and yes, they can have these cards too. Listen, I was going to do the whole YouTuber thing and complain about this throughout the video, and then at the end of it, I would tell you that there's a miracle answer to this, but because of this solution, it only saved me a ton of time, but it also saved my sanity. Now, this will only work on an emulator, but if you're looking to play vanilla Reshef with Destruction, I'll post the cheat code on the screen so you can use your emulator to remove the check. The effect still works, but you'll lose most of the flavor text from the cards when their effects activate. That goes for continuous and trigger effects of monsters. Not that I think it's a bad thing, makes this game a hell of a lot more tolerable. Although that's not really saying much considering the next aspect that we're going to talk about. So, the biggest issue that Reshef of Destruction has is its difficulty. Now, there's a difference between satisfactory difficulty and artificial difficulty. Something like Hollow Knight, which is tough, but is extremely fair in its gameplay, is satisfactory once you get some practice into understanding the moveset or you follow a boss's attack patterns. That's the sort of difficulty that can be satisfying because you earned it. A lot of games do this, and it's something that a lot of gamers seem to have credit to. Conversely, there's artificial difficulty. That's when a game can be made to seem unfair, and at times it can be because not of a lack of skill, but because of external factors that aren't exactly related to the skills or knowledge of the player. At least that's how I perceive it when you talk about difficulty in game. A better way to put it is that actual difficulty makes it harder to win, but artificial difficulty is what makes it harder to play.
Down on this?
You can look at some games that basically double the health of some enemies or lower the player's health. That's what I consider to be more artificial difficulty. But how does this apply to Reshef of Destruction? It's an RPG where you're playing a card game. It doesn't exactly have the same real-time combat situations like a Devil May Cry game or a real-time shooter. But that doesn't mean that there isn't artificial difficulty. Let's start with the resource system that Reshef has within it. If you recall, I brought up such things as the Duelist level, the deck capacity, and the money system. These are the three major ways that Reshef will make the game artificially harder, but there are some fun additional ways. So let's start with the Duelist level and deck capacity, since both are tied to the reward system and have a more interconnecting element, which it depends on both of those on what cards you can use in your deck. Here's the thing, every duel will increase your deck capacity, and sometimes your Duelist level will increase as well. The rate at which they will grow is criminally unrelated. Here's the thing. When you duel a named character for the first time, your Duelist level will increase by 1, and your deck capacity will increase by 3. Yep. And after that, if you duel again, your deck capacity will increase by 1, and there's a chance that your Duelist level will increase by 1 as well. Now this wouldn't be a problem if the deck cost for every card, at least the good ones, wasn't absurd. Let's consider a mediocre card, even by today's standards. The Celtic Guardian. It's a vanilla warrior type monster with 1400 attack and 1200 defense. Even back in the day, this card wasn't the greatest monster of all time. So how much does a deck cost? 161. To make it clear, your starting Duelist level is 72. So in order to play the Celtic Guardian in your deck, you'd have to win a total of 89 times and get a level increase. And to point out, your starting deck capacity is 1600. Now, in comparison to its previous game, the Sacred Cards, you would gain about 5 levels and would gain 10 to your deck capacity per duel. What? That is quite the steep difference there. So even if by some miracle you were to get a Celtic Guardian at the beginning of the game, you couldn't use it. And even if you did, there's no guarantee you'd be able to make an effective deck around it. The game makes you reliant on the garbage cards you already have in your deck and fall back mostly on the type advantage system that I brought up. Not to mention, even if you want to grind against opponents, while you can duel NPCs with no actual faces, until a certain point in the game, they're one and done. At the beginning of the game, you can duel Yugi, Joey, Tristan, and Duke repeatedly. However, the rewards are still paltry, and that's not even getting into the money system yet. One of the best ways to get new cards is the ante system. It's a system where at the beginning of each duel, you offer up a card for ante, and if you win the duel, you get a card from your opponent. You offer a rare card, you get a rare card. You offer up trash, you get trash. Of course, as a bit of a heads up, the only duelist you can effectively beat to grind on is Tristan, and that's because he's a terrible duelist. But his rewards suck. Yugi, Joey, and Duke at the beginning of the game are more or less a 50-50 toss-up since they have cards that are way out of your league. Baby Dragon, Swordsman of Landstar, Hourglass of Life, and Mushroom Man. I'm getting my tail handed to me by Mushroom Man. Yes, it is possible to beat them all, and you can get some of their cards, but it's a toss-up. Over the course of the game, so long as you duel everyone you can and find the key points of where you can grind against characters, you'll more than likely have a decent duelist level. For example, there's a point in the game where you come across Meku Tsunami in the Galapagos Islands, and you can duel him countless times. His deck mostly uses water monsters at that point, so if you pack your deck with thunder monsters, not only can you get some good leveling in, you can also get some really good cards to sell off and get some money. This leads us into the other element of the game, the money system, Domino. You see, early in the game, you don't get a lot of Domino to work with. And you need this cash flow in order to purchase single cards from Grandpa Muto's card shop. Mostly whenever you defeat a new opponent, you get a few new cards splashed into the inventory. However, even for garbage cards that aren't that great, you can't really get them unless you're willing to sell a ton of your money. Take Wood Clown for example. A card that is hardly worth anything, and it costs about 5,000 domino to buy it.
What?
No, exactly. I can't buy this damn card, which is honestly not that good of a card. At this point in the game, it would be good, but later on, it's terrible. Oh well, there's the password system. If you don't know, classic Yugioh games would allow you to input passwords that are listed on actual Yugioh cards, and you can get a copy of that card in the games. Although depending on the game, that would be utter bullshit. Well, good news, this game has a password system. However, in order to use it, you need to pay 1,000 domino to use the password system. And even if you do input the password, you don't get the card in your trunk. Oh no, it goes into the shop so Grandpa Muto can charge you even more. I swear this old man's got a frickin' monopoly on the card market in this world. Reshef has destroyed every other card shop in the world. Grandpa Muto, I am trying to save the world. Can you please give me a discount? No. You bastard! One of the best ways to get money in this game is to sell your cards, and unfortunately Solomon Muto here doesn't want to give you a good deal on it. Oh, he'll turn around and sell your cards at higher prices. Kinda reflects how card shops are nowadays too. But it's really all you can do to get good cards. Even at the mid-game when you face off against named opponents, the money they give you isn't all that great. And you can't get good cards for your deck. That's where the ante comes into play. You win your opponent's cards and sell them off to get domino. Going back to Mako, he has the possibility of dropping a really good card. Cards you can't use, like his Fortress Whale Dragon. A card with a duelist level of 999. Good luck grinding for that one, boys and girls. But you can sell at the card shop and get some serious green. But, and there always has to be a but in these situations, you need to have at least 2 copies of a card before you can sell one. For some reason, developers thought it'd be a great idea to make it so you can't sell or even antique cards you only have 1 copy of.
What kind of shit is that?
Now, from what I understand, the idea was to prevent the player from having a no-win situation. I mean, I don't see how that's possible, since you can't even use your deck without having 40 cards in it. Can't leave the menu until you do. Man, old man Muto must really need that money, especially since his nose is all messed up in his portrait. What the hell did you do to that, man? There's also the opponents. You've got a lot of restrictions on your card pool, and at the beginning of the game, you can tell that most of your opponents have a similar restriction. Well, save for the name characters, and when you get on the train to the museum, you can really feel the continual life points, especially if you haven't grinded at the beginning of the game like I did. Especially against Panic, who gets an initial field space to boost his cards. However, when you get to Mai, that's when the difficulty jumps again. She's already got a field spell active that boosts her monsters to insane levels at this time. And then you get to go to Canada. Yes, you go to Canada. That trend begins to spread to other duelists, even no-name ones, and they get more powerful cards. But the real turning point is Weevil. After you deal with the rare hunters and you're able to duel against the opponents again, Weevil's the first duelist to ignore restrictions that other duelists have on their decks, and it shows. A lot of his monsters have powerful effects or stats that get boosted by the field that he's on. I should also point out that this happens when you're recruiting these characters to fight the ghouls in the storyline. But the real fun, oh, that's when you reach Merrick. Regular Merrick, I mean, not Yami Merrick. He's dead. No one cares about him. Bye-bye. You see, at this point in the game, it will outright throw duelists at you have more than 10,000 life points, and then will put you through several gauntlets of duelists. That means you have a combination of everything. Weak cards, opponent having busted cards. We're talking about monsters that start off with 2,000 attack points that can be summoned for no cost, and that's before they get boosted by the Yami feat. And the fact you can't fully recover your life points? Normally I'm all for this, since a lot of games that I've been playing allow you to basically leave the dungeon, heal up, and come back to a certain point. This game at times will allow you to do that, and there aren't any long dungeons. Oh, but the final bosses. Oh boy. You know, I've talked about Forbidden Memories and how it will cheat, especially in the final boss. Well, good news everyone, that trend continues here. The only difference is that when you get to the titular Reshef, before you even face him, you have to face against Sol, the main bad guy, who is also Pegasus. You know, Maximilian Pegasus, who not only has a ton of powerful cards and starts off with 20,000 life points, and after that you have to face Reshef. But Pegasus, he isn't the easiest opponent. In fact, because of game design, Pegasus can use multiple copies of cards you're only allowed 1 use of. Change of Heart can permanently steal a monster of yours, and he's got 2 of them. He might as well have 6 though, since his Relinquished and 1,000 Night Restrict cards can steal monsters too, with the latter giving him 1,000 points of bonus attack. And he can stall to get his forces up because he has 3 copies of Swords of Revealing Light, which when played prevents you from attacking for 3 turns. and unlike the actual game copy, it doesn't have to remain on the field to have its effect be active. And not even your back row is safe, since he has 3 copies of Harpy's Feather Duster, which can pop all of your spells and traps you have set. If you're lucky to get through all of that, you have to beat Reshef, and continue with whatever life points you have after fighting Pegasus. Oh, you think we're done? No, this game hasn't started kicking your teeth in there, pals. Reshef has the ability to look at your hand, and the computer can know exactly what to play to counter you, but that's the least of your worries. A lot of Reshef's 4-star monsters, the ones that he can summon without tribute, tend to have about 1900 attack points, and thanks to the field Yami, they can gain a 30% boost to their stats. Nuvia the Wicked and Flash Assailant with 2000 attack are boosted to 2600. In the real game, both these cards were beat sticks that have massive drawbacks to them, because old school Yu-Gi-Oh card design wasn't the best, but here, they're normal monsters. They'd have no drawbacks. Not helped by his 3 copies of Castle of Dark Illusion. Not only does this card have the same stats and effect that it did in the anime, turning the field into darkness, so even if you change the field, he can change it right back, but its additional effect flips all of his other monsters face down every turn. So if he wanted to, if his monsters have effects, he can just reuse them against you again and again. Which only applies to one of his cards, Sombria the Dark, which is a 2100 beat stick that can pop a card by lowering its strength by 500. Oh, and remember when I said how Pegasus had multiple copies of cards you're allowed to only have one of? Reshef is worse. 3 Changes of Hearts, 2 Harpy's Feather Dusters, 3 Swords of Revealing Light, 1 Regeki which can destroy all your monsters when played, 1 Monster Reborn that can take the monster that's in your graveyard, 3 Pots of Greed which allow him to draw 2 cards, and 3 Torrential Tributes which should have been Mirror Force considering it pops all your monsters on your field should you attack. And he has all 3 Egyptian God cards. And if he summons even one of them, you're screwed! Game over, man! Game over! Oh, and to top it all off, Reshef's life points? 40,000. Twice what Soul had. Now, this is extremely unfair fight, and for my second run of the game, I'll remind you where I had a cheat that allowed me endless amounts of domino. I wasn't able to beat Reshef, except by deck out. Yeah, fun fact, those 3 Pots of Greeds will put your deck out quickly. However, when I faced against Reshef in a regular run, I managed to beat him with Slifer the Sky Dragon through deck out. You see, Slifer gains 1500 attack points for every card in your hand, and he's unaffected by other card effects, with the exception of the Egyptian God cards himself. So as long as you keep Slifer on the field, pop off a couple of Reshef's cards, and you don't overexert yourself with your resources, and don't let him summon his own God cards, you're pretty good. But I won by the skin of my teeth. But still. That doesn't seem right. Oh, and when you beat Reshef, you get 3 DC and 2500 domino. Your reward for beating up a god. I hope you guys can understand how the deck is stacked against you, quite literally in this case. Now, if it was just one of these things, I wouldn't have an issue. Overpriced cards, underpriced sell rates, slow leveling system, blocked cards, enemies breaking the rules, even the continuous battles where you can't even heal up your life points. Oh, and that's not even to point out the fact that if you use Slifer the Sky Dragon, its effect is continuous. So that means if you don't have that cheat I brought up earlier, you're going to be stuck with a long and very tedious battle. Now, the game isn't impossible to win, but in order to get decent cards, there are numerous points where you have to grind in order to increase your level, your deck capacity, and to get cards that you can sell off to get money. But a good portion of the cards, including some of the more iconic ones from the anime, are locked behind the Duelist level, and you can't even read the card's effects. The game is difficult, don't get me wrong, but a lot of that difficulty stems from the unfairness that the game's resource management prevents you, and it forces you to grind against certain opponents multiple times. And while it's satisfying to push Mako into the sandcastle he made on the Galapagos, that's not going to be the same for other people, and I can see this game turning away tons of people already. Reading reviews of the game, it's interesting to see what people thought of Reshef of Destruction back then. IGN's review giving the game a 5 out of 5 out of 10, it doesn't even touch on the difficulty of the game. Not to mention the card check, it just said it rehashes the Sacred Cards gameplay and hardly talks about the difficulty at all. Typical from IGN, really, especially back in the day.
Sonic was never good.
Personally speaking, while I don't think the game is outright terrible, there are issues with the game that hold it back, which sucks, because if a lot of the issues I brought up weren't in the game, that I could see this game being just as loved as something like Forbidden Memories. I will admit that the story does require the players to actually have a grasp on previous Yu-Gi-Oh knowledge, both of the manga and the anime, or even the previous game. There's a lot here that a person can get interested in the characters. There's a lot of charm to them, and actually takes what the Yu-Gi-Oh original had with them and does something new. Hell, in the original Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of these characters were just dropped to the wayside after a while. And that sucks, since I really liked Rex Raptor as a kid, because dinosaurs were awesome. Another aspect that I think needs to be brought up is that there isn't an actual tutorial in the game, especially for the type element system. Sure, that was brought back in the game manual, but most people probably aren't going to have that. God forbid you're a kid who picked up the official copy of the game without actually getting the manual. Good luck with dealing the cursor. But thankfully, I'm not the only one who sees how much potential there is to this game. There's actually a modded version of the game out there, Tolerable Reshef of Destruction, which adds a ton of quality and of life changes to the original game, as well as adding a few tweaks here and there to make it better. Some being that if you sell a card, you get about 50% of the card's worth back. The effect cursor isn't an issue, card prices never change, which I didn't even know was a thing in my 3 playthroughs of this, and changing things like making Torrential Tribute have Mirror Force's art, and fixing some stats on cards. Like, Nightmare Penguin for some reason in this game was a 5-star monster, when in the original it's a 4-star. Great choices there, Konami! Of course, when you get this patch it comes with a second one, where it only includes the quality of life changes, without changes to the cards or effects. So if you want to experience the pure game of Reshef without the cursor lag, then this is your go-to. Reshef of Destruction was a game for me in my young life that kept me up at night because of its grindy nature, and going back to it almost 20 years later brought back some nightmares, but also brought a smile back to my face. I've talked about this before in previous Yu-Gi-Oh videos, but one of the things I really don't care for with modern day Yu-Gi-Oh is the lack of innovation in media like this. Sure, you can say that the game lacks polish. That certainly is fair to say. But the game did try something different, yet familiar at the same time, especially for a Yu-Gi-Oh game back in the day. And while there are plenty of other Yu-Gi-Oh games in this world that have something similar to this, especially the 5Ds games, there's just something about overcoming Reshef of Destruction that leaves a much more satisfying taste in my mouth. Still, after playing the game with mods and cheats that skip the headache, I ain't ever going back to vanilla. And this is Reshef of Destruction. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know this was a bit of a curveball thrown towards you guys, but it's one that I've been wanting to make for a while since I started making videos on Yu-Gi-Oh games. Since Reshef of Destruction has a bit more of a story than Forbidden Memories or Duelists of the Roses, but held back by gameplay choices and issues. Which sucks because almost every Yu-Gi-Oh game has a ball and chain strapped to it. It prevents you from actually really being a good game. Reshef of Destruction has the markings to be an actual card game based RPG, and one that I'm a fan of, but it's held back by so much that makes it hard for people to see its glory. And don't get me wrong, I was willing to punch my computer's monitor in the final battle against Pegasus and Reshef. But now I'm left with an itch for a card game based RPG, something akin to Reshef, and unfortunately we're left with Sacred Cards, which is an incredibly watered down story with extreme easy difficulty, and Reshef, which at least takes an attempt at crafting more fleshed out story, keyword there being attempt. But it's held back by insane grinding and unfairness in its resources. Now, there have been plenty of games that use card games for their storytelling. Inscription is a very good choice, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for to replace Reshef. Rather, I would love to be in a world like Yu-Gi-Oh! A world where there's everyday people who are solving issues with card games, much like how Pokemon essentially incorporated the concept of their monsters in the entire world and how it's used to solve issues. I want to explore a world and fight against other people with card games. Something like that would be amazing. To those who think that a game like that would take too long since card games can take a lot of time, my average duel time when I was to get some decent cards in Reshef only took about 2 minutes or less. I don't know, maybe it's a pipe dream, but I've always wanted to have a game like Reshef, a turn-based card RPG, filled with characters whose decks reflect them as people and their interests. There's an appeal in what I'm not seeing nowadays. But that's just me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, and if you're so kind, please leave a comment. Every little bit of interaction on YouTube helps, and I'd appreciate if you share the video around. The more eyes on it, the better the video and the channel. I do what I do because you guys watch my content and share it around. And if you're interested in supporting the channel further, I have a Patreon, a Ko-Fi, and I have channel memberships turned on. I'm aiming to make whatever assets I make for this video public after it goes live, and if you get a chance to see this video ahead of schedule, as well as having access to my scripts if you join my Patreon. In either case, I think we're going to take a small break from Yu-Gi-Oh games, although from what I'm told there are some Yu-Gi-Oh games that I may want to visit in the future. Falsebound Kingdom and Capsule Coliseum. Maybe sometime later down the line, although I certainly would do more if I got funding for those games. I'm MangaKamen, and thanks for watching. And remember, get your game on! Wait, that's the wrong series.